Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you to everyone joining us today for this joint webinar between CAI and Quartic.ai entitled Validation of Cloud-Based Manufacturing Data, Machine Learning, and Analytics Systems for GxP Applications. My name is Mike Bartlett, Sales Director for Life Sciences here at Quartic, and I'll be hosting today's webinar. Joining me today are speakers John Hannon, Global Principal for IT and Automation for CAI, and Vinod Rodriguez, VP of Customer Success for Quartic.ai. CAI provides a host of services for manufacturing and critical operations across multiple industries, including commissioning and qualification, quality, compliance, regulatory, automation, and IT. Quartic.ai provides a powerful, open, and modular operational AI platform with industry-specific applications that accelerate time to value for our customers' Industry 4.0 initiatives. Our focus in today's webinar is how CAI and Quartic teams collaborated with a customer to develop standardized validation best practices, protocols, and service offerings that allow Quartic to be part of a validation solution in any stage of the life sciences industry. Our agenda today will start with John and Vinod introducing the different components of cloud-based systems used in manufacturing. Since the focus here is GxP, they'll review what needs to be considered when validating these systems. They will outline the validation best practices and how they apply to Quartic software. Next, they will describe the CAI and what CAI and Quartic are doing to accelerate and support these practices. Vinod will then end with a use case that's currently in progress. And now I'll turn it over to John.
Hi, thanks, Michael. Okay, so as we jump into this, we've got a graphic really to talk about what we get when we are working with the cloud. So on the left side of this graphic, when we talk about traditional IT, these are all the things that a potential client would deal with from at the lowest level networking and storage, the servers, the middleware, all of these aspects leading up to the application. And all of that traditionally would be in a data center that would be on the client site that they would manage, and they would manage all of these different aspects. As we move into the cloud, there's two different models that we want to talk about. And the first one is the infrastructure as a solution types situation. And that's where a cloud provider is essentially taking the networking, the storage, all these purple things at the bottom, and they're taking care of all those aspects from the servers. And then because it's infrastructure, the client is still required to deal with applications, data, runtime, and middleware. And then we have platform as a service. And in the platform as a service, you can see that on the far right side where we have the Cortex software, which is orange. So Quartic is now taking place and running software that's in the cloud. So the cloud provider is providing the servers, the storage, et cetera. Quartic is providing the middleware, the runtime, the application, and the data. And you can see that it kind of changes a little bit from orange to blue. And what that is that the actual client firm, the regulated firm, they still have aspects that they have to do. There's configuration within that application, within that Quartic application, and there's data aspects within the Quartic application that client actually becomes responsible for. And so what we're going to talk about as we get into this is what does that look like from a validation perspective, and how do we validate this when we have a model that's a platform as the service model with the Quartic software. So let's go to the next slide.
Right. So let's take a look at how these different components are translated into the services, the programs, and the structure that you're likely going to consider when you're crafting your digital solution. So starting with the capability for connectivity. The first is to support data transfer from the edge to the cloud. We need to accommodate different manufacturing protocols, OPC UA, MQTT, ODPC, historians, and we want to be able to support different formats and types of data as well. So once in the cloud, we need to be able to consider storage and contextualization capabilities as well. Depending on your uses and the applications for this data, which can range from visualizations to building dashboards, or deploying machine learning models and AI to be able to populate those dashboards. You may want to implement different storage sinks that are optimized for each use. Then we'd like to have all these things to share the same context in terms of maybe a physical equipment or where and how these equipment are operated in your processes. As we get into more of the intelligence layers and the application layers, we look at supporting the deployment of AutoML. or maybe even OpenML for analytics and different kinds of modeling. This can be taken a step further by allowing access to this data and analytics via an API kit or an SDK. So this allows any user under your corporate umbrella to be able to extract information into their own environment or even build their own applications as well. So how do you accommodate for all of these things? Well, ideally, most digital initiatives are using or experimenting with similar technologies as shown on screen. The effort comes from being able to stitch them together in a workflow that can lend itself to be easily testable and easily validated, and not just considered shadow IT work. Really looking at extending past the DIY into an enterprise type solution. So the way the Cortic builds this workflow is by looking at containerizing all these services in Stack to be able to take care of the management and maintenance of these individual components. So before we jump into a little bit more content, we have a quick poll question for our attendees here. Has there been any concern with validation, or is concern with validation kept you from deploying an operational analytics system or application in the cloud? You should see a screen like this on your, a poll question like this on your screen, which you can simply answer. We'll give you a few seconds. And we'll close that. We can also share the results before taking a deep dive. So it looks like that at least 60% of us have had some sort of concern, or validation has kept us from being able to deploying some level of operational analytics into the cloud. And for the rest of us, that's great. I'm glad that you're being able to accelerate into this journey. So for those that do have the fears, well, let's look at what our approach has been working with CAI and how we've applied this approach in actual practice.
Thanks, Vinod. So when we look at validating anything, there's basically a three-pronged approach that we take for validation. And those are seen in the three bubbles here. There's a data integrity approach. And the data integrity approach has to do with things like audit trails and ensuring that we've got the right data, ensuring that if the data changes, that those changes are recorded. Then there's this security aspect. And the security aspect, that includes the credentials of the people accessing the data, ensuring that the data is secured. It also includes the backups, disaster recovery, and making sure that the data is going to stay secured in its condition. And then there's the validation aspect. Now, the validation is the functional testing, where we go through all the functional aspects and features of the system, and we look at how all of these aspects come together. When we look at something like, say, 21 CFR Part 11, all these three aspects, the data integrity, the security, and the validation, are kind of the three principles of that regulation. So when we look at all of our validation, we're always looking at basically these three lenses of how validation comes together. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So the V model has been around for decades. And if you're not familiar with it, basically what we have on the left side of this diagram is all of the plans and requirements and specifications that it takes to make a software system. And then on the right side, we have all the testing. And the way that this model works, it's actually known as a waterfall model and has other names. But the way that it ultimately works is that the level of specification and the level of testing detail at the very bottom levels are very, very detailed. And then at the top level, they're not very detailed at all. So when we look at the cloud computer systems and we look at the Cortex software, most of the Cortex software is validated in this kind of green area where we have detailed functional specifications, we have detailed design specifications, and we've done detailed testing. Now that testing that's done is of the functional nature. And the reason, as we're going to see in a moment, is that a lot of the data integrity and security aspects that are associated with cloud systems are tested separately in terms of how they go together. But there's still these orange levels up above. And part of that is, for any validated system, the system has to be validated for its intended use. which means ultimately that the client that's going to be using that system, it has to be validated specific to that client. So in the aspect of the Cortex software, there are configuration items that the client has specific data and specific configurations, specific models, and other things that are very specific to the client that they have to configure. And there's functional testing that actually comes about this. Now, this configuration aspects, these are very high level compared to the dark green, very detailed functional aspects that are part of the Quartic validation. But they're there nonetheless. And so as we look at the validation as a whole, what we're going to see is there's going to be aspects from the client that are configuration aspects. There's aspects from the Quartic application, which are functional aspects. And then we're also going to see some of the cloud aspects in terms of how that comes together. Okay, Vinod.
Great. So let's take a step here to translate that previous slide of individual components, programs, and services to now more usable functional layers in a digital infrastructure. So defining these layers allow us to determine which layers are at risk and require review and verification. Some of these lower layers are not subject to change at all. They're quite static, and essentially they're made out of pipelines and storage sinks. So it becomes very straightforward to maintain and test for their quality during internal engineering development and release as a software vendor. As we start to get to the higher layers of data consumption, this becomes more subjective. And this is, as John mentioned, really looking towards the user's intended use on the client perspective. This intended use is the starting point. What are we using this data for? Or the analytics, or the modeling output? Who needs to be exposed to it? And what does the end user want to get out of it? So let's relate these exact same layers to that initial cloud structure that John introduced us to. And let's focus on the bottom layers at first. Data exists all along the edge in the cloud. We need to account for those principles of security, integrity, and validation that John mentioned throughout these layers. So Quartic's aim is to remove the responsibility of these principles, which cover the maintenance, the management, and eventually even the validation of these layers as much as possible. As John mentioned, any cloud vendor provides the hardware equivalent infrastructure to support the runtime and the middleware components. These runtime and middleware components in Quartic become the core edge infrastructure. This is the connectivity to be able to connect to data systems, to control systems, to lab environments, databases, historians, sensors, PAT, what have you. These are tested and these are subject to validation practices. Now, as we move up, the layers start to focus on data consumption. This becomes much more subjective. So Quartic's aim here is to provide customers with the support required to validate their data consumption, regardless of whether you are creating workflow models, so something like AutoML workflows to monitor deviations in your process parameters of your process. This might be something straightforward and repeatable, but it's subject to the user choosing the right parameters, their training ranges, and even having the correct process understanding. It could also be something like building a predictive model to create virtual sensors, or focusing on the accuracy of the final models. The idea here is we want to be able to support model development and analytics throughout Quartic's journey or throughout the user's journey, and even with out-of-the-box applications. So for example, something like continuous process verification, where you want to monitor an entire process from a multivariable perspective. How do you govern these procedures, and how are these procedures governed through documentation and practices? Well, as an example, the kinds of support that Quartic will provide that can be relied upon in governing these procedures is looking at something small like taking into consideration version control of data, models, and code. If the user is allowed to change the data, change the models, even change their processes, how is that captured in Quartic or in any environment? Or something like logging and audit trails of changing models and the outputs of these models. The idea is that by providing these features to the user, we can essentially help them accelerate their practices and building their procedures. So we've taken a look into the landscape of this cloud. I've seen what it looks like from the edge to the very end of the cloud, and the components that are involved and that can be subject to the validation. So John's going to take a deeper look at what the requirements for these validation efforts are.
Thanks, Vinod. So I mentioned before that we had this cloud portion of our application that we wanted to take a look at. And the way that this actually comes together, if we look at the major organizations that provide cloud services, all of these organizations have been audited, and audited typically by a big 6 type accounting firms. And there is an audit report. This audit report is known as the SOC 2. It's a very detailed audit report. And what it does, when we talked before about these 3 main focuses of validation, the data integrity, the security, and then the actual functional validation, within the SOC 2, this is a very, very detailed audit report of how, say, an Amazon Web Services or a Microsoft Azure, it basically goes through how exactly that they achieve the data integrity or the data security with their servers, their infrastructure, their monitoring, their audit trails, et cetera. So all of these things are very detailed in the SOC 2. Now, there are also a couple organizations within the pharmaceutical world, ISPE, the International Society of Pharmaceutical Engineers, PDA, the Parenteral Drug Association. Those organizations have been looking to address how do we actually bring cloud systems into our validation? How do we do this? And basically the direction that both of those organizations are going down is to embrace the SOC 2 as a method of saying, okay, other people have taken a look at this, they've done the assurance, and we need to accept what's in the SOC 2. Now, it's more complex than that, and there's guidance documents that are being written and other things, but the net result is when we look at the actual cloud infrastructure, the acceptance of the SOC 2 for data integrity and security are the main things. Now, again, in the model that we have with the Quartic software, the Quartic application is actually on, residing on the cloud services. So there are application aspects that are then functionally tested. And so there's additional functional testing for the application over and above what's in the SOC 2 that would be part of the Quartic validation. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so as we take a look at what would be in that Quartic validation, all of the items that are on the right side here, from the security testing and the system installation and the notification period, all of these are functional items. These are items. This is stuff that's not in the SOC 2. So when we look at the validation package of the Quartic system, the Quartic system is going to have basically 3 components to it. From the validation package, there's the aspects that are in the SOC 2, which are the data integrity, security aspects. Now there is some security testing that's listed here on the right side that I'll talk about in a second. But then there's the main thrust of the functional testing of the Quartic software. So for example, in the Quartic software, there are security aspects for authentication and Windows authentication that then tie into the security aspects of the cloud. So there's kind of 2 parts to that, which is why you would have a SOC 2 portion and you would have a functional portion. And then additionally, there's going to be this portion that's just specific to the client. That's going to be client specific configuration items that are specific client data, specific client models, et cetera. But as we look at the portion that's the Quartic portion, that's all the functional testing, that includes the sequence of ops, it includes any alarms, interlocks, notifications. It does include all of these items, even if they tie into the SOC 2. All of that's included in the Quartic validation package. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. Vinod.
So we've discussed so far what our approach, what Quartic's approach is to these different components in a cloud system, in a cloud-based application. One thing that we haven't touched upon or highlighted is the integration to third-party systems as well. It is a basic requirement to have these services, these components be exposed to other systems, whether they be ERP systems, MES, QMS systems, or CMMS systems. The difficulty starts to increase here as we approach their validation requirements one by one. So teams generally have to consider individual verification validation of these connections. of these individual components on screen to our third-party systems. And this is generally done in a dev val production environment one by one. So there is a cost and time implication here, but also a focus on the development lifecycle in a DIY type approach. So there's always going to be some sort of evolving solution. And the way Quartic looks at least trying to manage this, the way we build it out, is we want to be responsible for the maintenance and the management, the lifecycle of our entire product, which means that everything from edge to cloud is subject to internal SDLC, or software development lifecycle, and our internal QMS standards. So apart from just providing validation packages, and we can also provide development testing reports and test benches and results for any application of the environment, which can help you with your guidance documentation and your SOPs. Moreover, when changes are applied into a cloud environment, there are no effects to the data or the database. So that means users have the option to really deny upgrades or run them through a dev or val environment before even deploying them into production. The aim here is to provide an infrastructure and really a life cycle that is as seamless as possible whenever it's changed, and is integrated seamlessly and changed seamlessly wherever it's applied and wherever it's applicable. What the customer is ultimately responsible for is that configuration part, the uses of the features and how they adopt and interpret the results. So this includes creating the SOPs, the SWIs for validation, for models, validations of alarms, notifications, write-backs to the controller, or even just contextualizing your data by identifying and labeling your critical process parameters, your key process parameters, your CQAs. The intent here is that as we provide the information, the documentation, and the guidance, the user can interpret this and set this up to whatever use that they're applying this for, whether it's simply a descriptive use to be able to understand how my process is performing, or to be able to make a decision on this result. So we're going to have John just summarize some of the implementation guidances from our customer experiences, and then we're going to jump into the use case as to how we applied these practices specifically.
Thanks, Vinod. As we spoke before, when we look at ultimately the solution that we have from a validation perspective, there's three components to it. There's the cloud component, where we look at the SOC 2, which basically covers a lot of the data integrity aspects and security aspects of the platform. There is the Quartic application component, which, even though it does have data integrity and security aspects, is really focused around the functionality of the application in terms of how the application functions. And then ultimately, there's also a component of what the client is using, which becomes client-defined data, client-defined models, client-defined data structures, et cetera. So those are the aspects that go together that actually produce what becomes the entire validation package. And so as we look at within this graphic, all of these things together make up how that validation package comes together and how it's going to be used. Let's go to the next slide.
So we have one more poll for our attendees here. And this is just really to gauge as to what kind of practices or what kind of efforts that you're currently applying in your companies. Are you looking to adopt a validated cloud solution, or do you have any efforts of adopting a validated cloud solution in the next year? We'll give you a few more seconds. And we'll end this poll now. So let's take a quick look at the results before we continue on. Great, so we do have at least 80% of our attendees here that are looking to adopt some sort of solution in a cloud environment, hopefully within the next year. So here's an example of how we've been performing and working with CAI to adopt a solution over our past 6 months. So in this application, what we essentially have is a continuous reactor that is capable of producing multiple different recipes. Now, depending on the product in production, the customer needs to monitor its parameters and also validate the product quality using PAT equipment. This has to be done in real time, and we wanted to leverage a cloud environment to do so. So the ultimate goal became could we qualify a complete closed loop system? And could we use Quartic or the Quartic platform to connect the data, store data in a cloud environment, analyze this data in real time, and then suggest set points for these continuous chemical processes? And this was our solution. First, we separated our strategy for the data connection, storage, and streaming and integrity from the analytics. The data integration, the management, is treated like a data historian validation. Data is streamed from the edge via a controller, from PAT, through whatever protocol available. In this case, it was OPC, and stored in a cloud environment. Now, it was important to have bidirectional communication to the desired controller so that the intelligence, machine learning models, could suggest set points back down to the controller. Second, the data analysis and the real-time modeling is completely governed by the user. So let's see what the solution actually looks like. And we'll relate this to the structures we had shown earlier in the slide deck. So a few things to note here. In this specific implementation, our modeling and intelligence is operated from the cloud environment. This can also be deployed locally if required. It's just a matter of comfort or application. The controller, if there's any loss in any internet loss from the actual local environment to the cloud, will still control the process using last known set points. The idea here is to minimize the danger of losing any communication. So let's take a look at this breakdown of runtime and middleware. Our focus here is to be able to deploy that runtime or the middleware, the edge middleware, to connect to a PLC or an OPC server to stream process parameters. Likewise, this connector is also going to be able to stream data from a PAT equipment, in this case an NIR, and stream all this information directly into the cloud. This gives us information about the process, potential characterization, and any input from the local HMI as well. This could be something like batch information, campaign ID, who was using the equipment, or anything else that we considered that can be collected from that HMI. Once this information is transferred to the cloud, that's when the intelligence takes place. And this is where we have a little bit more of an integration, and it's a little bit more of input from the SMEs themselves. The idea here was to have the Quartic platform completely manage the process by looking at historical data and building a recipe and a set point recipe on historical process. So let's look at what this flow looks like. We started off by building out a target product profile on historical data and storing this in the cloud. What was initially subject to validation by our functional specs was the connections to the PLC, the connections to the NIR, and any data transfer and storage in this environment. All of this is taken care of, or at least covered, by the validation packages. The infrastructure of the cloud itself, again, is covered by the SOC 2 of the cloud provider. The security, the redundancy, the resiliency of that is taken care of by that cloud provider. What Quartic focuses on in this case is that middleware to be able to either stream that data seamlessly, and of course the modeling and the infrastructure, modeling analytics. So our focus in this model is to be able to predict the CQA, which is read off the NIR or based off the NIR, and have this entire prediction run in the cloud. Additionally, we wanted to verify that the current process conditions are accurate and meet the target product profile. We can validate the process conditions by looking at what the product quality is with the IR. So Quartic is continuously sending information of what the CPPs or the control parameters should be to the edge. And when set point changes are required, those changes are continuously sent down to the controller as well. Because that data transfer is taken care of in the functional specifications and the functional validation, we don't need to continuously validate this or continuously review this for every product being produced. As this process takes place and changes, we will essentially have CPPs being changed during the process, and this becomes a cyclical flow. Similarly, the IR readings from the reactor are also collected, sent up to the system, and used to be able to predict a CQA, in this case, the concentration of the product, or at least verify that there are no impurities in the product, instead of taking an offline lab sample. All of this is seamlessly done with one edge device located on-premise to be able to see, to locate it and validate it on-premise to be able to seamlessly pull this information, as well as send information down, so send signals down into the controller or into the NIR. The rest of it is happening in the cloud. Now, there are additional integrations that we can also consider here. For example, our next phase with this project is to not only control this one process unit at a time, but also look at multiple equipment processing at the same time. In addition to multiple equipment, we can also look at integrations with a QMS system. Because Cortic has the product profile stored, either through a contextualized layer of understanding what the CPPs and specification limits are, any deviation from that can automatically be collected and sent to a QMS system, creating a deviation record or a quality notification in a QMS system. The data is readily available, can be packaged, and of course, allow the user to even come in and perform analytics or investigation in the system. So this is just a very high-level view of this application of how we've implemented the Cortic platform from edge to cloud and gone through the process of providing packages and procedures to create these models that will govern this process. So we are seeing success in these efforts and these practices that we developed in this application. But we are also very aware that this is just the very starting step.
So now what's to come? Quartic will be part of the license and manufacturing submission and reviewed by regulatory bodies like the FDA by the end of the year for this use case. Quartic's journey so far has been to bring ourselves up to par with what's expected in GxP manufacturing for analytical and process control systems in cloud environments. And our focus has also been to build an infrastructure that contains streaming, integration, storage, and analytical environments that can be validated using traditional CSV procedures. The next steps will be to focus on how we accommodate enterprise-level infrastructure, many assets, and eventually multiple sites, as Vinod described, and how we integrate non-traditional analytics into production and manufacturing workflows. Examples of those being machine learning for optimization, deviation investigations, and applications like CPV and real-time release, all of which will become more mainstream as companies become more fluent with the associated CSV. These analytics and applications are multivariate in nature and are generally governed by user training, SOPs, and guidance to interpret results and make decisions. This means there is subjectivity that depends on the risks associated with the output results or decisions. And Quartic will be working with industry leaders like CAI to actively bring this level of guidance to these practices. And this concludes our webinar content today. Now we'll open it up to Q&A. If you have any questions and you haven't entered them in the chat or Q&A sections, please do that now, and we'll start running through these.
So, Mike, I noticed there's quite a few questions out there. I'd like to take the first one from Scott Drapp. What has prevented organizations from pursuing machine language AI validation in the past? That's a great question, actually, because historically, AI validation has been challenging. And the reason it's challenging is because in order to do true AI validation, you need very large data sets. And what you end up doing is you end up training your AI with a portion of the data set, and then you end up validating the AI with another portion of the data set. And so if you're looking in the context of how we're doing Quartic validation from an AI perspective, well, we verify that the software can create a model, and then we look at what might be an anomaly or anomaly condition for that model. So you have to have a massive amount of data essentially to train the model. And then once the model is essentially trained, then we verify that the model can find the anomalies with additional data. And Vinod, if you wanted to jump in on any of these questions also, please feel free. You could probably get into more of the details, but I'm just referring to more of a functional type validation in terms of how the AI works.
Nope, I think you hit the nail on the head there exactly. So if we look at if we move past the functional and we get into the things that are governed by our operation procedures and policies with the customer itself, choosing of those features that that lead to the training ranges, the date ranges, the selective batches, the exclusion of features, the transformation of features. That's what would be really governed by the customer itself, where we would need to understand, the customer would need to understand and provide that SME expertise to say that, yes, this makes a model with these features and these ranges makes sense. And this is how I should move forward. And that's really the part that is, I think, a little bit more pivotal and requires a lot of internal documentation and procedures to leverage a tool like Cortic.
Yep, agreed. Okay, next question. How does this accelerate the AI ML adoption in a GMP regulated environment? I think we're going to more AI. We're seeing more AI. We're seeing complex systems that lend themselves to AI management. So in terms of how does this accelerate? Ultimately, I would hope that ISPE or PDA would actually ultimately develop certain guidance documents related to validation of AI models. As those don't yet exist, what we're still looking at is what I mentioned in the previous question. You have these big data sets, and you're essentially you're taking part of the data set to train the AI and then part of the data set to essentially validate the AI model. Now, how does that accelerate the adoption? I think the only way that we're going to accelerate it is once we get actually industry guidance, more industry presentations and documentation in terms of how it's being used, and then that would have more industry acceptance. Vinod, other items on accelerating adoption?
I think, again, you've nailed it there. So really, if you look at the efforts that are placed into accelerating adoption from a validation side, we want to be able to alleviate as much of that as possible from the customer. Really, the focus should be simply what your intended use is and how you're going to be able to use this model. The setup, the infrastructure, the connecting of that infrastructure, and the maintenance of that infrastructure shouldn't be something that's done internally. That's just going to be a barrier.
Gotcha.
Hey, John, right. I'll give a shout out too. This is Mike, to the ISPE team that's actually working on the Validation 4.0 initiatives, and they've done a lot of work to provide the guidance. And there's really only a few fundamental things that are needed to really to push that out into the market.
Excellent. Okay, can the customer team execute the validation package internally, or the services of CAI and Quartic required? So at this point, for the Quartic application, CAI has created a validation package and executed a validation package. However, the package is such that I think if you were a client, a Quartic client, that you could actually execute the bulk of the package internally. And I'm thinking specific, when we went through that, I think there were some specific items in terms of like maybe QPro configuration that maybe could not be executed by the client. But I think almost every action, every function that we did could be executed by the client. Vinod, did you have other items on this particular question?
Ultimately, Cortic AI is a software company, a software vendor, where we look to CAI as for their expertise in this validation field. But this collaboration has led us to, as John mentioned, create these packages for you to be able to execute internally. What we will provide as a software vendor are the services to help you navigate the environment and accelerate this as much as possible. But there's absolutely no reason for it to be able to depend on CAI or Cortic, and you can execute these internally and completely by yourself.
Absolutely. Okay, next question from Scott. What responsibility does the organization executing the machine language have in completing the validation? Do they need to define thresholds for model performance? What types of considerations are required in completing this? Vinod, I'm going to give this one to you. I think that the person doing the validation needs to have an understanding of what the model is trying to accomplish. But if you'd like to talk a little bit about the thresholds of model performance, I think that's where the answer is coming from on this particular question.
Sure, and I think this also ties into another question that we have here, which says models often require retraining. How does this impact the validated environment? So our intent here again is that the data integrity and the data security side of things really accelerates that need for validation. So if we look at basically retraining the model or the types of consideration in using that data, well, what we've taken care of with the initial validation of the edge and the hardware and the data transfer is ensuring that what data is generated at the edge, whether it's a sensor, an inputted value into a database, or a scan from a PAT equipment or anything similar, is essentially the exact same and stored in the exact same way and available to all the users exactly as it is. Now, where we start to get into the nuances is understanding what those thresholds are for performance. So depending on the intended use case now, if we look at a model just simply just identifying failures, we want to be able to maybe identify these failures or predict these failures before they violate a product specification list. In this case, we need to be able to assess the risk of the model and the risk of interpretation of these results. And these are the kinds of the procedural packages and operating procedures and working instructions that need to be developed. This is ultimately governed by risk. We need to be able to understand what the risk is to the user, what the risk is to the product, and ultimately in a pharmaceutical or biopharmaceutical environment, what the risk is to the patient. So that's our main consideration in completing this kind of an effort.
Totally agree. One thing I would like to add to the question regarding the retraining. So if you're in a validated environment and you're using that model for a GMP critical type activity, then yes, when you retrain that model, you're going to impact the validated environment. You're going to have to essentially revalidate the model that you're retraining. However, I would also argue that in a lot of cases, how you're using the software and how you're using this data may not be GMP critical. So for example, if you're using the software for 10 different aspects and only one of them is GMP critical, and you're changing something that's not GMP critical, or you're retraining for something that's not GMP critical, then that may not require a revalidation. It kind of depends on what the risk level is of how that software is affecting your process.
That's right. And to add a little bit more color to that, even more color to what you did, John, is to say the validation part, again, isn't focused on the connectivity and the edge. The validation is focused on how the model has changed, which features the model is used, and the data in that model, which means, again, that the features that Cortic provides, like version control, logging, and audit trailing, helps us determine how these changes are affecting my users and how the users can interpret the different changes from the different models themselves. So this is something very small that can be built in, and of course, extremely useful. But version controlling my model or comparing the changes before and after my model versions is extremely useful to the user, and extremely useful to being able to generate procedures and reports for validation.
Okay. And then I did want to verify, did we have from the chat section, were there questions from the chat session? Yeah, there is.
I think there were a few questions there.
Yeah, I guess, Vinod, do you want to answer that first one about PLC platform limitations?
Yes, so there are no PLC platform limitations. There are no data connection limitations of any kind. The idea is that it is completely agnostic in terms of supplier, vendor, connector, data source, formats of data. Again, the focus is that the infrastructure has already been created. We simply need to be able to focus on connecting to the correct data source, extracting the correct data, and using that in the correct model analytics. That's the focus, at least, that Cortic has. And I see that there's a follow-up to that question. What is the primary reason or hesitation for moving data in the cloud? I think, John, maybe you want to take this one?
Sure. Well, probably the primary hesitation is that there is no good guidance document. There is no good published guidance document for the pharmaceutical industry on how those controls exist. Now, there are a number of presentations. There's a number of articles that have appeared in publications such as Pharmaceutical Engineering. And there is definitely a groundswell of support for the SOC 2 type cloud stuff that we've mentioned. But that has not yet been put into an actual GAMP cloud guidance document. So that GAMP cloud guidance document doesn't exist yet, which I think is the hesitation. Also, I think companies, especially larger companies, may ask the question and they say, well, we have our own data systems, or we have our own data repositories, et cetera, why would we need to use that? We could use our own data repositories instead. And so there's probably aspects that come into play there. For smaller organizations, say like a smaller biotech, they would definitely want to use the cloud because they're not going to have a room full of servers. They're not going to have the redundancies that are built in. But there may be hesitation because that guidance document's just not quite out there yet.
Yep. And I think just in terms of a technical aspect as well, just looking, the fear of starting and failing is a huge thing. From our customer experiences, as I've shown on screen a few slides back, there's multiple different components. There are multiple different programs and open source components that can be used to create and stitch together to create the solution that you need. Sometimes the maintenance of these components, the life cycle of these components is hard for them to maintain internally, and that's where you don't get started. You continue working in non-validated shadow IT type environments, and that might be good enough for the current situation. But in order to be able to move into a little bit more of an let's say Industry 4.0 environment, we think the cloud is inevitable.
And there's one more comment from Ray Boudreau. Can you see that at the bottom there, Vinod?
I don't. Oh, yes. Are there challenges with integrating into DCS systems like Delta V, ABB, or Honeywell? So far, we have not had any challenges. Our focus is to be able to integrate to the data streams directly from these DCS systems. So via OPC to be able to stream parameter information or control information and batch information and directly have this information stored in Quartic. Alternatively, we've also integrated through these DCS systems via a historian or via another route and use this information within Quartic. We're also looking at being able to address connections to the batch control information and adopt more contextualized information available in DCS systems into Quartic. But currently, we have no limitations in terms of connecting. It's just a matter of determining what the ideal infrastructure looks like and what the best way to be able to expose their data at the shop floor currently is. So in one of our previous webinars, we actually spent some time on this, and it'd be really good to be able to expose yourself to that information and look at what the infrastructure looks like when connecting to a DCS system, a historian, and maybe even some additional sensors simultaneously.
Awesome. Okay. Well, I think we covered all the questions. The nod.
Yeah. I think that's about it from questions. If you have any other questions, either drop them in the chat or feel free to reach out to us. I'll hand it over to Mike otherwise.
Sure thing. Thanks, guys. So thanks, everybody, for attending. We hope this was informative. And certainly, if you want to discuss any more of this in more detail between CAI and Quartic or both, specifically about implementation of these protocols and validation in a cloud-based environment, please reach out to us and we can have a deeper discussion. We'll follow up in the coming days with a link to the recording. It should be out, I would say, by early next week at the latest. Please feel free to share that with any colleagues who weren't able to join or register. And then also please keep an eye out on our LinkedIn page for upcoming webinars, where we'll continue the journey to actionable intelligence that we started as Vinod had referred to. So with that, thank you again for joining us. Thanks to John and Vinod again, and have a great day.